Okay, go for it.
Hello, good morning, and welcome to everybody. This is the fourth meeting of the European External Relations Committee in 2013. And at this gesture, I'll request people, if they have mobile phones, electronic equipment, etc., if they would please have them switched off as it interferes with our communications. I'll go straight into welcoming our panel this morning. We're very fortunate to have a lot of distinguished academics amongst us. Tom Hamilton is the Director of Education and Professional Learning. Tom Finn is Chief Executive of General Teaching Council for Scotland. Now, this is going to be a slightly difficult one for me to pronounce. Richard, Lord, thank you very much for helping me. He's the director who's with us as well. And then he is chair of National Panel for Scotland, and Jenny Brady, Jana Brady, yes, thank you, convener of Scottish Parent Teacher Council. I want to thank you all for being here this morning. I also want to thank you for giving us your evidence in writing, which has been very helpful. And I will invite questions immediately so that it will give us more opportunity to answer and take questions. And I'll start off with Claire, first of all, please, if I may.
Good morning, panel. Thank you, convener. I'd like to ask a few questions about the funding issues that have been raised in a number of the pieces of evidence that are there, and really to get an understanding of where you think in terms of funding that whether or not you believe that the aspirations and ambitions of the Scottish Government can be delivered within the funding mechanisms that have already been put on the table. I don't know if someone...
That was the easy one.
The General Teaching Council can start on that, because we're not responsible for funding, so we can express comments and we don't have any responsibility for what we say. I think it's important to note that the funding that was suggested by the Working Party was indicative, which suggests that I was a member of that Working Party, we were not sure just exactly what would be needed, but what we did was we recognised that at the outset that there would be a need for 2 to 3 times the £4 million that was originally planned for the delivery of mother languages. Now, this is a programme which is to be sustained over 2 parliaments, so inevitably the costs could well escalate, and the developments which local authorities and schools will take forward will have indicative costs. I would suggest that the costs were probably most likely to be found in the teacher education and in the provision of resources, and it may well be that the costs that are currently indicated will have to be reassessed and revised as time goes forward. But as a starter, it's a welcome introduction to the funding which local authorities have.
So I'm Richard TALLARON, and my organisation is Le Français en Écosse, and we train teachers, primary and secondary teachers. I think funding is, of course, crucial to this project. When I started running the training called MLPS training 10 years ago, we used to do 27 full days, which was very expensive to run. It worked well, but very expensive to run. I think what we can do now with funding is be maybe more creative. We do need face-to-face training with the teachers, but I think we can use the funding for more online resources as well. And I think that's a very important point, a very important part of this project will be the online resources. What we can also use, and we can be creative with EU funding. I mentioned in my written evidence, we run exchanges between Scotland and France and Scotland and Spain. We have something like 2,000 primary schools in Scotland. When I work with Créteil in Paris, they have 2,500 primary schools there. So we can find partners between Scotland and France and Spain. So I think funding important, but we can be creative with it.
Anybody else wants to?
Good morning. Gianna from the Scottish Parent Teachers Council. Just put a parent perspective in this. We are concerned about the resources and sustainability of those resources, particularly when it comes to stepping up the teaching qualifications. It is a specialism like any other specialism, and then we're very concerned that that is treated as such. It's not an adjunct to a primary school teacher's string of skills, specific language qualifications. And that's very important to form a good basis for young people to continue that learning skills as they grow up and use it into their adult life.
Ian Ellis, National Parent from Scotland. I think my concern, or our concern about the funding is it enough? If you take it across the whole of Scotland, 4 million isn't a lot of money. And it's, again, is it sustainable? My concern is if you put it in the pot and it goes into the director's pot, what says that they're going to use it for languages? And I think that's a big issue. That's a big issue we've got.
If I can come back in with the point Ian's made, I mean, I think the GAE allocation to a city like Edinburgh from 4 million would be somewhere of the order of £220,000. So that's not an awful lot of money, but it is a start. I think the question that Richard raised is an interesting one, because as expressed through Jana, we're not looking simply at giving some top-up support. We're looking at providing a base of knowledge which teachers are able to communicate to pupils. And there will be different levels of that. There will be the qualification which is needed to enter or exit from teacher education to work in a primary school. There will be the qualification which is necessary for secondary teachers, and I was one in modern languages. So there will also be the need to look at those teachers who are currently working in schools and will not come through any new system over the next 10 years. So there's quite an impact needed on those teachers as well as on teachers who are coming into the profession over the years to come. But the important thing I think to remember is that we need to ensure that if the project is taken forward, it's taken forward as part of a serious development in Scottish education for the purposes as outlined in the report of improving the language qualification, the cultural knowledge and the social opportunities for young people of the future.
Good. The British Council gave evidence at our last session, and one of the concerns they raised was the drop in foreign language assistance across Scotland. And I would just like your opinion of where you think foreign language assistance sit within the proposals that we have, and also part of the committee's work, and this included some visits, and I was there, and Richard was there at St Elizabeth's in Hamilton, where we saw the use of technology to deliver some of the curriculum instruction and support for the students there. And I would also like your opinion on where technology and resources can sit. Not replacing foreign language assistance, but to maybe provide some of that work that they would have done in the past.
Well, for example, I think foreign language assistants are crucial, are very important for this project as well. But to answer your question, modern technology will help us if we can link a primary school and a class within that school to a school in Spain or in France. We get the culture that foreign language assistants would bring to Scotland, but we get it using all our schools are well equipped with internet facilities and video conferencing. So let's use these facilities. We can use them. It's cheap. Again, small is beautiful. 2,000 schools. Yes, we can do that, and we should use that more, I would say.
I would say from classroom assistants are extremely vital within the school setting to support classroom teachers. Qualified foreign language assistants equally so. So we see it's a fundamental staff, integral to the teacher and learning staff within the school. That's very clear, whether it's the musicians or languages or scientists, whatever happens to be. Just to build on your point there, one of the things that we've discussed around this is to say that languages is integral to the curriculum, not an additional synthesis in there. So why not have arithmetic taught in Spanish, for example, engage their young boys. Spanish in particular become part later on to what natural languages we taught with boys who want to work, play for Barcelona, for example. What better way to engage them early on in their curriculum to do that, numeracy skills there, and join up classrooms so the actual young people can get taught Scottish history in, I don't know, for example, in Mandarin, at the same time as a Chinese classroom in Beijing is doing the same thing. So, but answer to your question, qualified language assistants, enabling that within the classroom to support the classroom teacher is vital.
I think both the use of foreign language assistants and the use of current and modern digital technology can be significant advantages because for many of our students in schools, the language that they are studying is from a different culture and a different context. And the contextualization of the language by the use of the foreign language assistant or by the use of modern technology helps to bridge that gap. And if we look at other European countries which have made greater progress than Scotland has, then the culture of English-speaking people is very much more prominent than the culture of French-speaking people or Spanish-speaking people is in our country. So it's not uncommon, for example, in the Netherlands or in northern France or in parts of France and Spain, for people to regularly watch television programmes which are streamed in English. And I think that would be a significant step forward. As a linguist myself, I listen to and watch programmes in my foreign languages, and I think we can all find things that would interest us. The reference to Barca might be inappropriate this morning after last night, but there are lots of good schools where teachers have linked with foreign football players who are playing with clubs in Scotland just to try and improve that contextualisation. But I think, going back finally to the foreign language assistants are relatively cheap, and they have drifted away over the last 15, 20 years. My colleague in Angus, who's going to speak to you later, his authority is one of the few which has kept a high number of foreign language assistants. In most other local authorities, because of understandable financial constraints, they've disappeared. But they actually cost very little. So to bring them back would be one step forward, which would be quite helpful to the development of this context.
I'll ask Jamie to come in at this.
Well, just a supplementary on top of Claire Adamson's questions on funding. In the written evidence from, I think it was Neil Logue, from the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland, it says that there is quite clearly insufficient funding available at this time to deliver the 35 recommendations of the report of the Languages Working Group. And then it goes on to say it welcomes the 120,000 to fund the pilot projects and the 4 million, subject to, obviously, Parliament approval in the new financial year. You don't say in that if you think that's enough. Is the 4 million enough to deliver the Barcelona project?
No. Simple no.
Well, I mean, have you any sort of have you quantified it in any way? Do you think?
If I look at it, I come from Western Bartonshire, and if you take it, our cut will be something like 50,000, 55,000 to teach 34 primary schools and an additional 2 languages. It's not a lot of money if you take it across that. And we really, as we said, the last question was the language assistance. As Tony said, that's the cheaper solution, but you need to embed it, and will 50,000 cover it? I can't see it.
I think rather than use the word cheaper solution, I think we should be using more economical.
Oh.
I don't think anybody wants to be described as being cheap.
Can I just go just a little bit further on that? Do you think that this project, the Barcelona project, the 1+2, is an expensive way of achieving what we're trying to achieve, which is better children speaking more languages in Scotland? Or do you think it's quite a good idea?
I think in principle it's a great idea. It's just I think the concern of parents is how it's funded. Is it going to be sustainable in the long term? I think the 4 million will be a good starter, but my concern is where do we go in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years time?
So when you say it's a good starter, it would actually cover you're still saying it's 50,000 isn't enough to cover your local authority budget.
It'll be very tight.
I would just support what Ian is saying there. We're concentrating on primary schools here, and the primary schools, in my experience, have really embraced the curriculum and incorporating different teaching methods. And my concern is that they may be able to pick up this aspiration and run with it, only to find that when our children go to high school, they've got a different level of complexity and challenges at the high school, and it'll come to a screaming halt. So all the momentum and all the good work that's done through maybe early years through the primary schools is not sustainable and cannot be delivered at the high school. And I think that is from a parent's perspective, that's a real concern. And that is a different scale of resources altogether.
Thank you. Claire?
I think I'm fine.
You're fine, okay. Jamie, did you want to come in with your...
It's my
yes.
Right. Yes. Well, this is a general question. Should all future primary school teachers have a language qualification, as is actually recommended by the working group? And if so, at what level should that qualification be? And do you think that this proposal is feasible, and how long would it take to implement? And that's my first question.
I'll start off with that. It is a very good aspiration to have, absolutely. And what the 1+2 report says is about having a language qualification at CQF level 6, which is the equivalent of higher, or higher and equivalents. And that seems perfectly reasonable. However, there are real challenges in getting there, both in terms of the initial qualifications that people bring into teacher education, and there's a challenge for the universities in terms of meeting that requirement. If it's going to be an exit qualification, they've actually done that. There is a tension, there is undoubtedly a tension, because there are lots of competing voices trying to get their tuppence worth into teacher education. So we have a real imperative here in modern languages that we haven't done well for a number of years. But we also have the STEM subjects. We have science and maths and technology wanting similar things put into place. There is a danger that we set the entry qualifications for teacher education so high that we don't get anybody coming into teacher education. Now already, most of the universities are moving towards quite high qualifications in terms of 4As, for example, at Glasgow to get into teacher education, into the undergraduate programmes. That's pretty high. If we start specifying too minutely what the qualifications are actually going to be, you're going to have a very narrow cohort of people coming into teaching. So if we say higher English is a requirement at the minute, the standard grade credit maths is the equivalent at the minute, and that will change shortly with the new qualifications coming in. But if we put an imperative on having higher modern languages to come in, then we say a higher maths to come in eventually, then we say you do really need a higher science, the danger is you're not going to get people in. So there's going to have to be a realistic appreciation of what we can do and how long it's going to take, because that's a fair point to make. We're not going to change this overnight. You don't have the people coming through having modern languages qualifications, enough of them at the minute, who want to go into teaching, who are going into teaching. So it's going to be a build-up of momentum to this project, and that's why I think the kind of realistic timescale that's been spoken about with over the two parliaments, and I have to say I think probably beyond that, is quite sensible.
Yes. Do the existing teachers who are there at the moment and the training assistants require more resources to be made available to them, to be available to teach the appropriate languages? Do they need more training and support, the existing ones? And specifically, I think, question for Le Français en Écosse, how should teachers be trained to meet the Scottish, how should they be trained now to meet the Scottish Government's present proposals?
Yeah, I would like to agree, first of all, with Tom. I mean, it is a challenge, and we've been saying it's going to be a challenge at primary level, secondary level, further education, but we have 7 years to achieve this. I'm generally quite optimistic. I think it is possible. Yes, we can. We can achieve this. We have to be creative for at further education, for example, if we require, if new teachers will have to have a certain level at languages. There's no doubt about this. For this project to work, at initial teacher training, we will need to do something so that all the new teachers, when they start working in primary schools in Scotland, have a good level of French or Spanish or whatever the language. Now, of course, it doesn't have to be on when they start college. It could be 4 years later when they finish college. So they could get trained. If they don't have the higher level when they arrive at college, then they can get to that level after 4 years. Do current teachers need more training? Yes. They do. With all those of us...
I was going to say, as a general comment, I think we should be raising the bar for new entrants into the teaching profession. And I think the teaching profession really needs support from parents and politicians like yourself to sponsor that and raise the status of the have in society. I think there's been a lot of dumbing down of that profession, and they're really under squeeze in terms of the terms and conditions currently over the last few years. So I would, as a parent, I would like to see the qualifications for practitioners in the teaching profession raised and right across the board. As another sort of comment, I think the existing teaching classrooms do need support. I think they've gone through a massive change through the curriculums. I think within the secondary school sector, the skills that the classroom teacher has to deal with peer pressure, bullying, as well as their class subjects, there's a lot been asked of secondary school teachers. In the primary school setting, I think it's no longer sufficient to have a teaching qualification for primary schools. I think computational skills and numeracy is key, as well as languages. And it's not the language they have, but the ability to communicate to the young people how they can pick up languages of any nature. And it's actually important, the culture, Tony mentioned the culture, and the change and shift of the methods of teaching within the schools. And that's what we need to enable our head teachers and our classroom teachers to achieve. And that from a parent's perspective.
If you look at the needs of current primary teachers, and we can go back quite a number of years to look at the previous programmes which have been used to prepare primary teachers for the teaching of a linguistic component. And going back over that period since late 80s, early 90s, there have been significant improvements, and Richard has certainly helped. But one of the difficulties of the programmes that we have used to date have been that they were completed and never attested to, never accredited in any way, so that the programmes were as good as they might be, but no one ever could be certain just how good they were. Now, I was an evaluator of a programme in the early 90s, and at that time there was a bit more rigour in the programmes and there was a bit more resource to support it. But I think what happened increasingly over that period of time was that the funding for European modern languages went into the budget which was allocated to local authorities and was used differently within each local authority. In some cases used extremely well, and in other cases used perhaps not quite so well. So what we have at the moment in our primary schools is a range of teachers who are in some cases very well equipped to take this agenda forward now, and in others they are not so. And the dependence on having within a particular school somebody who has had that training and that support is very sharply focused when that person leaves, because a school which currently is teaching a modern foreign language in a primary school cannot continue it if the sole teacher, and it is sometimes a single teacher who delivers it for the others, leaves. And added to that, there are a number of people who are qualified modern linguists who did even a degree in a foreign language at university, trained as primary teachers, but didn't particularly want to get involved in the servicing of the language experience of other children because they wanted to teach their class. Now, that's a perfectly respectable position to adopt. But what it means is that we have teachers in schools just now who have been trained using the models over the last 20 years. We have teachers who have graduate qualifications in modern languages, and we have teachers who have higher, but we don't actually know at the moment where they are or who they all are. So we do need to audit that and find out the extent of the issue that we face. So I think that we will certainly need to look both at the qualifications of those entering teaching, and that's a responsibility for the General Teaching Council, but currently it would be inappropriate for us to say that the standard on entry would rise too quickly, because there are youngsters in our schools who might become very, very good primary teachers and who have not been prepared for that change in the expectation. So that's one of the reasons why the committee suggested that that qualification should be reached either on entry to or on exit from a course in a university. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of the significance of that and balance it against the other expectations about curriculum that Tom has suggested. So on the one hand, we have to look at trying to ensure that for the future we have a continuity of expectation with an understanding of language competence and an understanding of the pedagogy that would be required to use it in a primary context, and in addition begin to address the large number of teachers who haven't been through any form of training, some of whom may require a small top-up, some of whom require a very significant top-up. So it is quite a difficult issue to try to predict into the future, but there are certain needs there which will have to be met.
Can I just come in on that? I totally agree with what Tony's saying. I think what we rely on just now is the goodwill of teachers. You know, some schools probably won't teach languages because none of the teachers will want to do it or feel confident enough to do it, as Tony's saying. I know in my own school, it's the teacher that delivers it is because he'd done a higher French when he was at school, and he's now he's going to France for weeks doing courses. He's doing that off his own back. It's been paid for, but it's still his. And I think that's, to me, we need to look at it as in the teacher training. Has it got to maybe be put into actually the coursework? Maybe they don't need it to go in, but maybe it's got to be incorporated a wee bit into it. And I think we need to start looking at, to me, that's what it is. We need to get it so virtually every teacher, it becomes part of their coursework. And I think that is the only way.
And just to add to the points that have been made in the last couple of minutes, the change in schools that's been alluded to already, one of the things that has to go hand in hand with that is a change in the confidence level of the teachers, and that's part of the issue, I think, here with what Tony was saying. If you look at some of the international research on what makes successful education systems, there's an OECD project called TALLAS. Now, Scotland, the UK is not part of TALLAS. TALLAS stands for the Teaching and Learning International Study, I think it is. And one of the significant things that TALLAS says is that education systems that are successful have teachers with high levels of self-efficacy. And if we can bolster that, if we can encourage teachers, if we can enthuse teachers, if we can have teachers who are not hiding their own light under a bushel because they want to actually celebrate and join in the success of the school, that would be a big move forward. And one of the things that the GTC can do, since it became an independent entity last year, is to actually accredit programmes. We always accredited the initial teacher education programmes, but we can accredit other programmes now that lead to things that we have a system called professional recognition. Now, professional recognition is just that. It's a professional pat on the back, if you like, from the professional regulatory body to help celebrate the good things that go on in teaching, the good things that go on in Scottish schools. So to bring people forward for professional recognition in what they're doing for modern languages within the primary school, within the secondary school, would seem to me to be part of moving that culture forward positively.
Do you wanted to go into?
Yeah, a couple of quick questions there. I also sit in the Education and Culture Committee, so obviously we've been looking into to some of these issues in terms of quality in literacy and numeracy, and the evidence that came quite strongly forward from that is that a higher qualification in maths or English didn't necessarily qualify you to teach literacy and numeracy. And it's really to get to the, can the pedagogy of language teaching be given to someone who hasn't got a higher qualification, and can that be incorporated into the training? And also it was mentioned about the standard, and the Cabinet Secretary for Education has said that he has ambition of teaching me a master's degree qualification and raising the status of teaching. And one of the descriptions to me is that teachers would come out with an empty envelope that was filled with continuing professional development and professional qualifications that would then lead to that master's. And do you see that the language teaching, the continued professional development, could be incorporated into that process?
Yes. Take the first question that you asked, Claire. The pedagogy of teaching a language needs to be understood by the teacher. So the teacher needs to have at least a degree of understanding of the language before that can be presented. And so I think that's probably self-evident. I mean, your reference to the need to have a certain qualification in maths is a good one, because what the research finds is that the parts of mathematics which are most relevant to the work which is done in the primary school are what those of us who are old enough to remember would call arithmetic. Whereas the confusion that can sometimes arise is that the mathematics, someone may be very good at elements of mathematics and not particularly well trained to teach those arithmetical concepts. So, but a modern foreign language is different, because you can't break that down as easily. There does need to be a level of understanding, a level of communication, and that, I think, has been set in the report as being at the level of higher, or SEQF level 6. The pedagogy can certainly be given, depending on the expectation of the standard that we are asking of from our teachers. And referring back to the point I made earlier about the linguistic competence of those in other European countries, many of them don't have particularly high qualifications in English, but they have a degree of understanding which could be similar to our level 6. And I think is where we would want to go. We would want to aim at that particular point. Going back to your masters, I mean, that's a long-term aspiration, and we in the General Teaching Council are looking to try to ensure that the courses that teachers use in teacher education provide opportunities for master's credits. And courses which are emerging as a result of the Donaldson report, which you'll have heard a lot about in the other committee, are beginning to look at degrees of specialism. Now, degrees of specialism are just that. They're specialist components on top of the generalist requirements. And it's perfectly feasible that there could be components of specialism in modern languages which could be accredited to master's level and could help to fill that envelope that you referred to.
Thank you. I'm conscious of time, so I'm going to try and allow committee members to ask more questions. Alan, would you want to come in?
Thanks very much, Convener. My question has to do with some of the previous witnesses' submissions to us, and they're really suggesting that the involvement of parents is something that we could perhaps benefit from at schools and teaching languages, particularly in light of these challenges about not having the teaching expertise there. And we also had feedback from our convener, and I think it was Claire and Adamson who was there as well at Dalmarnock Primary, and the involvement of the community there. So really it's to ask you is how can we involve the communities and parents to become much more involved in encouraging the children to learn languages at school, and perhaps you could cite some other examples other than the splendid one that we heard about from Dalmarnock.
Our primary school here in Edinburgh at one time had 50 different nations, the pupils in our school. Most of those were bilingual students, and bilingualism as a huge advantage in itself. But many other schools in Scotland, we have children coming into our school that English was not their first language, and that was a challenge for many schools. And it's working very closely with the home and parents. Often those communities, parents themselves don't have English at all. And it tends to be children within that family who are the communication link between the school and the home. So parents are very key to either children whose language is not the first language, or indeed children whose language is English to take on a second. I think there's two different components there. what's very effective in the first example, when English is not the first language, parents have a key role, but we are very clear in the Scottish Parent Teachers Council that when you are teaching languages, you need a qualified practitioner in place in school to do that. And for parents to kind of help that at home, to homework or other places, you require a qualified person in the classroom. Sorry, thank you.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I would also say, though, that involving the community is very important. And it's easy, maybe not so much for the teaching of the language side of things, but the cultural element. I'm a French person, and my children go to the local primary school, and I'm invited on a regular basis. I go there and speak to the P1 or P6 pupils and talk about France. That's something which, not necessarily in French, but just talking about France. We're running a project in Borders in Melrose Primary School. They have different communities involved. We're going to have a sports day there, and we've invited the parents, the community to join. Some of them will bring food with them that they've prepared from their own country. You know, so we're going to be celebrating languages at a cultural level there. So yes, it is important. This is of value. Let's value these people who come to Scotland and can share their culture and language with us.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think I would support it would be hypocritical of me not to support this, because I have done the reverse in France. But at the same time, I think it's important to recognise the distinction between the assistance which a member of the language community can bring, both culturally and contextually, and differentiate that from the work that the teacher does. Because the teacher needs to understand the pedagogical context. The teacher needs to have a qualification in the language itself, and what the community can bring is something which supplements that knowledge, which assists the teacher, but which doesn't replace the teacher.
I totally agree with what they're all saying. We should be relying on the parents to do basically what could be the teacher's job. I think it's working together. And I think I can't give you any schools off by hand, but there are schools out there that will be spectacular at it and will really fully use their parents working alongside teachers. But there's also quite a lot that don't, and they could do. I think there's more scope out there to actually get parents more involved, but that's another issue.
I think you asked for some examples. I'm aware of some schools which have brought in French restaurant owners to work with home economics teachers. So they weren't just working in the modern languages class. I'm aware of schools which have brought in football players who were from different European countries, and they have worked both in the language class, where sometimes they found it very challenging. One can imagine why. You know, their understanding of the language being communicated would be very different from that which was being communicated. But they've also worked with PE staff and worked with others. So I think this cultural additionality is important, but we do have to understand the boundaries of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Convener. And if I could follow up with another question, and that is that, you know, in other countries, if we look at how they do things, is this approach used by them? And if so, with what level of success? And if any of you maybe would also like to comment on the issue that we heard about, which was about, you know, classrooms interacting with each other in our country and in countries abroad. I mean, I actually thought that was potentially quite exciting, not just for little children to be learning, but for adults as well, because I could imagine communities where, you know, just a room with computers and, you know, access to Skype and so on would offer all kinds of possibilities. Would you like to comment on that?
I can talk about France, obviously. The English is the language taught in 99.9% of French primary schools. Primary schools in France don't tend to involve the community, sadly, I think. However, now in France, they're really trying to push the ICT side of things, the technology side of things, and they are really keen to find English-speaking partners. Now is our chance in Scotland to really, I've said that before, but to link up, you know, our Scottish schools to French schools. Now they are getting access to internet, they are getting computers in France. We're ahead of the game in Scotland by maybe 6-7 years at least in terms of computers and equipment. But the rest of Europe is catching up with us, so, and they want English-speaking partners. Wonderful.
If I could add to that.
Dundee University has a version of its undergraduate teacher education programme for primary, which has been delivered by Dundee University staff in Athens, in English, to Greek students. And I was out recently with staff from Dundee University visiting. And the school that we were in there, a lot of the instruction in the school is going on in English, despite the fact it's a Greek school. A lot of the instruction is in English. But just the point about cultural involvement, the school decided it wanted to have a football academy, and it didn't want to have any partisanship from the supporters within the Greek football area in Athens. They didn't want that. So they went to Italy. So they've actually got a link with Juventus, of all people. And staff from Juventus are there working with the kids. Now, there you have something that really is quite European. And Greece is not the best example these days in terms of European moves. But it seemed to me to be a very positive way of integrating different elements.
Thank you, Convener. Thank you. That's fine.
Okay, thank you. Any other members wish? Yes. No.
Thanks very much, Convener. I wonder if I could just come back to the earlier issue about funding and resources. My view of sitting in the committee on a number of occasions now, the contributions made by people that have been invited has been very, very positive. But this morning, I have to say, Mrs Brady and Mr Ellis, you were possibly the least optimistic of contributions that I've heard so far. And indeed, Mrs Brady, you've expressed grave concerns in your contribution to the committee. Can I ask you to clarify what you mean? We're not starting from a blank sheet here. There's already some really good work going on in primary schools in Scotland with modern languages, so we're not starting from nothing. Are your concerns about looking ahead to the future? Because you mentioned it, Mrs Brady, that you're concerned about the transition to secondary, I think. Are your concerns more about that through process to secondary, or are you really concerned that the whole system for primary as it starts is just not doable with the funding that is planned to be allocated?
A bit of both. Taking the latter first, within primary schools, it really does depend on the individual head or teacher championing that within the school. And as Tony mentioned, if they move on, that particular valuable resource moves on, and there's a gap, a void there. So there's inconsistency across schools within even one authority, and inconsistency across local authorities in terms of language teaching within the schools. So, and that's to do with not necessarily to do with resources, but to do with the championing within that school or at that authority. Sometimes it's not a matter of resources, it's actually looking at the teaching methodologies and how they work in the classroom. We've had experience in our authority, like many authorities, the budget's been completely slashed. And when there are good initiatives going on, and that somewhere down the line, our elected members and our officers want to look at what are the positive gains, but sometimes you need seed corn money, as this initiative's doing, but it's not way down the line to actually see the benefits for that. So when there are initiatives like this, our concern to the money is that there's significant resources being put into this and championing at not only at the government level, but within senior managers and local authority. I'm looking at the directors of education here to enable that. So where there's a will, you need resources and you need a commitment. Going back to the sustainability of it, I think we really have to take a bit of leap of faith here and put adequate resources into the profession and to the schools within Scotland to see it through. So you don't get the scale of the exercise, I'm being not very clear here, in primary schools is more achievable. The scale within high schools need a completely different mindset and resources and commitment at that level to sustain it through. So my concern
you're saying we need to fund that also now, or are we thinking about that later?
Now we have, within the high school here, because I've got children in primary and secondary schools, our school favours the more traditional routes, and so we've got a broad subject choices going through all the way through to a higher if you wish to. That's not the case in all schools in Scotland. So when children are faced with a choice early on and they probably see employability just now, that they choose subjects that they would see a future either to get into university or employability, and languages and music and all the other rich type of things tend to be dropped along with the arts. So the way the school is structured and organised can determine what a young person's subject choices is. That is quite evidence, I think, across Scotland. And those that have the Scottish perspective, do you have the Scottish perspective?
I think I know where you're coming from, as in the funding wise, but as we said earlier, in primary schools, there's tremendous work in some primary schools, but there's also nothing happening in other primary schools, and it is the goodwill of the teachers, and that's how it is just now. So you can't say we've got a structure in place, because I wouldn't say we've got a full structure. In some schools there's wonderful structures and there's tremendous work going on, but it's not an even playing field we've got just now. And even just going by authorities to authorities, it'll be in one primary school, it'll be spectacular, and it'll be non-existent in another primary school. And it's trying to get it across the whole board is where I see the difficulty is. We personally I think it's a tremendous thing. I think my son is moving into secondary school after the summer. If my son doesn't come out with a language in 5 years or 6 years' time, I think my son's going to be disadvantaged. I think what's happening just now is a lot of kids are not taking languages in secondary school. I think if we can get that embedded in primary school, it's going to change their culture, and they're going to take it on, they're going to go to secondary school and they're going to want it. I'm just desperate. Let's do it. Can we do it right, please? To do it right, we need to sustain it. I'm sorry, I'm passionate about it, and I just think we're disadvantaging our kids. I mean, Richard's French, their kids speak English. Most of their kids will speak English. Most of our kids will not speak French or another language, and it's our kids that are getting disadvantaged through it. And that's our biggest concern, and that's why we're talking about the money. And I know we're on a very hard time just now with money. I don't like saying it, but ring-fenced. And I know as soon as you mention ring-fenced to politicians, it's, oh, back off. But my biggest worry is we do it just now, and I hate to say it, I'll just use my language that I use, we play at it, and we put it in. 3 or 4 years down the road, the budget that these people have got, the directors have got, and they've got to make the hard decisions. Is that an easy cut? And so that's why we're saying, is it sustainable? But I think for our children, it's got to be. And I really look forward to, I'd love to come back in 5 years' time and everything's working perfect, because I think that is the best start in life we can give our children just now, is giving them a second language. Okay.
Yes, it's sticking with the funding issue, because I think it's something that's really important, and I just would be glad that maybe this is something for the directors of education to maybe help to answer this. But it's about the European aspect of it. Now, one of you, I don't remember who it was, made the comment at the beginning that we're going to need 2 to 3 times the amount proposed by the Scottish Government to be able to deliver this. And I just think, to what extent do we actually draw down European funding as good as we could? Because we've had evidence to the committee previously, not on this specific aspect of education, but in the more global aspect, that we're just not drawing down nearly as much money as we could draw down. And how can we set about improving that, at least for the education sector? Because if you could match pound for pound, at least you would maybe arrive at double the amount of money we've got at the moment. Hopefully we'll even get to 3 times the amount that you wanted. But I just think that we've got to work harder, not at blaming the government. And I'm not a big fan of the government, as you would expect, being an opposition member, but I do really think that we've actually got to work much harder at getting the money that's available in Europe to actually deliver some of this. We're not being good at doing that at the moment.
I know I've been down in the money, but the bottom line is any money is better than no money.
Absolutely.
And so I've got to put that in, even though I'm down in the money. But as for match funding, I don't know how that was. Maybe Richard's better to...
Well, I'll just say one little thing about... I think you were right in saying we're not starting from scratch here in Scotland. I mean, I go to many primary schools around the country. I don't think there's any school in Scotland, primary school in Scotland, where they don't do a language, at least from primary 6. So that's a big advantage. I mean, that's a solid base, I think, for us to. I mean, 1 + 2 is very exciting, but we're not starting from scratch, and that's important. Regarding the EU money, yes, we could use it. We could use it more in Scotland. When my organisation when we started the immersion courses in France and Spain 10 years ago, 5 or 10 teachers throughout Scotland used to apply and get a grant to go abroad. There was so much money with British Council, they could not spend the budget at the end of each year. It was incredible. Now, through my organisations, and there'll be other, obviously, organisations, we have more Scottish teachers, but there's still money out there. We could run more courses abroad and create these exchange programs. We were involved in a radio program. That's where I met Tony the first time. But you've got radio program is a European program whereby you have 4 or 5 primary schools, 1 secondary school, a local authority involved in Scotland, and same setup on the other side. It's costing nothing to us here in Scotland, but it means that hundreds of pupils can then start exchanging.
What do we need to do to get that money, though? I mean, what is the barrier to that at the moment? What's stopping us from getting that money from Europe?
It's passing on the information to the schools. That's a crucial part.
Who's not passing the information on?
I'm not even sure it's as simple as that. I mean, I think there's a deeper cultural problem that we're trying to address through this initiative. And at the moment, organisations such as Richard's and some of the local authorities are particularly good at getting European funding, and others aren't. And there is European funding that other countries access more readily than we do. And there are parts of the European budget that we get quite well provided for in other parts of education. But perhaps this is an area where there is scope for us to develop. And you may want to ask my director colleague Neil and colleagues from local authorities at the next session. But I do think it is partly because of the culture. Exchanges and visits, for example, there are countless people from European countries who want to come and take part in exchanges to Scotland. But there are not proportionately the same number of Scottish teachers who want to take part in visits the other way. So what we're trying to do is change that culture, move it forward, and hopefully, as we do so, we'll be able to take advantage of developing EU funds. For example, Comenius is just changing. The Comenius funding is opening up new opportunities and new possibilities. And it's just changing, so this is the best time to go and look at it.
That's very helpful. Thank you, Convener, and that's good.
Just to add to that, if I may, under that umbrella of Comenius, there's one project called Transversal that exists at the minute, and it's going to be part of the changes. But what Transversal does is fund visits by teachers, local authority officials, people who are within the system in terms of moving education forward. The GTC's hosted a visit every couple of years for the last few years. We've done that. And we've had people from all over Europe coming to look at what goes on in Scottish education, coming to look at what goes on at the GTC. In terms of people from Scotland making use of the transversal funds to go to other places for these study visits, there is money left in the budget every year. Not enough people are taking up that opportunity. Now, partly it might be communications about not knowing that this is available, and we've done our bit to try and publicise things for transversal. But the other difficulty, I think, and it's a genuine difficulty, is people are so involved in the day-to-day running of their particular job that they find it very hard to get permission, but they find it very hard to leave their own responsibilities and go abroad for something that actually would be refreshing, would be interesting, and they would come back with good ideas that could be then used for the benefit of Scottish education.
If I may convene it, is it something that, you know, if a team of people across education in Scotland, local authorities, people like yourselves and others, had a very focused working group on this, that you could actually really get into this? Because I feel that, you know, we shouldn't be just about blaming the government for not doing the right priorities. We should be about actually getting that, doubling the money that the government has got to exist with at the moment, so that we can help them. I mean, I think round this table we're all absolutely converted to the idea that it's the right thing to do, but we need to help them to get double or treble the money. So the challenge to you is, can you go out there and work collectively to help the government to get that money and help our children to get that money to do this exchange work that we need to do.
Yes, and in fact, it's a proposal I've submitted to, where there's a group called COALA, you know, Cultural Organisations and Local Authorities. Back just in October, we spoke about just that. How can we improve that? There is money out there, there are opportunities out there. How can we help? So maybe the next step will be to create an action group. That's a good idea.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just comment. I mean, there's been a number of concerns, well, perhaps concerns is a strong language, but a number of issues raised today which have been slightly different from others, and I think they're very welcome. And Ian's point and also Janine's points in terms of resources is a very valid one, and I recognise that. I think you're absolutely right. We need to be more focused on where we are just now. We all talk about all the goodwill that's out there. We want to use parents, we want to use the goodwill of the community, we want to use classroom assistants. We also want them to be qualified. So if they become qualified, do they then become teachers? There's also the twinnings of schools across Europe, and there's also training of languages for teachers. I don't believe any one of those is free. There's a cost implementation on all of this, and therefore we need to be able to identify and quantify that cost. I think it's only fair and reasonable that we do that. But I think Helen's point at the end was a very good one in the sense that we need to try and work as a team so that we can identify additional resources. And you know, people say this is not enough, but no one's actually said how much is enough. So you know, so that's also an important element. So we need to grapple with that issue as well. Yes, there are schools that have no language, and there are schools that have more than one language. And whilst we congratulate the schools who have been successful, we still need to support the ones who have not been successful to date. And twinning is probably a very good idea. So the question that I want to ask the panel really is, if, and I rather than be diplomatic about it, particularly the chief execs and others, I mean, you of all people know the implementation of the resource implication on this because you're experienced in delivering services. What is your opinion in terms of how much resource, if more needed, would be needed to try and address these issues so that when we do deliver the service, it's in fact meaningful and successful?
That's a really difficult question. I come from a local authority background and I was a secondary head teacher, but the job I do just now in the General Teaching Council is not about spending the resources that are provided by government. But I was on the committee, and the committee's view was that the £4 million which was allocated to support language learning should be doubled or tripled. Now, that was an indicative figure. I wouldn't pretend that it was based on a scientific analysis of the likely needs, but it was an expectation that would lead to, it was hoped, ongoing discussion with government and, as Helen has pointed out, other agencies from which funding could come. So I think the best we can do is give you that figure back. And anything I gave would be a personal opinion based on my previous experience, but given that I speak here on behalf of the General Teaching Council, it probably would be more than undiplomatic for me to give a direct answer to that question. Okay. But you can detect that I do think there's a need for greater resources.
Okay. Okay. Rod.
Yeah. And could I move on slightly to another issue, which is kind of transition between primary and secondary school, and how we provide continuity of teaching. Any thoughts on that from the panel?
That is a difficult question. I think it relates to a question which hasn't been asked yet, which would be about which languages should be used. And I think maybe if I could pick that up in passing, en route to the I pick it up en passant en route. But it's possibly one of the biggest practical difficulties that has faced clusters of schools. And the group, when the group discussed this, the group tried to wrestle with this particular problem. And in the end, the group suggested that it was necessary for us to work with what we have, rather than to plan for something which might occur in the near future or in the long-term future. So we were suggesting that local clusters, secondary and primary schools, should have a plan for the delivery of that continuity, because Well, on the one hand, there is an argument that if you do Spanish in primary school, that's in addition to your range of language competences. It's one of the languages in the 1+2. But if you go to a secondary school which doesn't offer Spanish, then that can be a significant break in your continuity. So what the group was suggesting is that the local authority schools needed to work together and ensure that continuity was there. That will require some difficult choices. It will require schools to decide which are the languages that they're going to work to sustain. And it might have implications for the languages which are offered in the secondary school. There might be some cases where there are more languages offered, and there might be some where there are fewer languages offered. Now, when I was a principal teacher in modern languages, I had French, Spanish and German all in the one department. And there were large numbers of pupils going through that. There are not many schools nowadays, perhaps very big schools might have, but in some schools, languages are in decline. And the languages which are on offer in schools are not the same ones across the country. So there will be a problem in transfer also from one part of the country to another. But in the end, I think it has to be down to careful local planning to deliver that continuity. But I'm not going to pretend that it's easy, because it isn't.
Can I just say, as a parent's perspective in that, I think Tony's hit it in the head. There's not much point, as a parent, there's not much point in my child doing Spanish in primary and the secondary school doesn't do it. If he does Spanish and French and the secondary school does French, then great, he's getting two languages. But I think they've got to work in a cluster and actually deliver something that's going to be more beneficial and they can move on. And I think a lot of parents would be concerned that as long as they do the primary subjects that they're doing in the secondary, I think that should be first and foremost as they move through the transition. So it is a transition rather than just a stop and you're starting again. I think parents would be very concerned in that, but I think a lot of schools now, they do, the transition is a big thing that they look at, and I'd be very surprised if they don't have continuity with languages.
Thank you very much for that. I'm calling time now for this part of the agenda. I just want to formally thank you for participating with us this morning. It was truly very educational, if I may use the pun. And I'm also grateful for your honesty and clarity. You've been very helpful. Thank you very much. I'm now suggesting a 5-minute break to change over for the panel and conference break. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to our second panel. As our first panel leaves, thank you very much. Let me welcome Neil Logan, Representative Association of Director of Education in Scotland, and Robertson, Modern Language Department, Office, City of Edinburgh Council. Robert Nicol, Chief Officer and Councillor Douglas. I was wondering whether I would recognize you. I do recognize you. Welcome. Who's the spokesperson for education and children and young people, convener of Scottish local authorities, COSLA, and Janice Bryce, Curriculum of Excellence Support Officer, Dumfries and Galloway Council. Please allow me to welcome you formally. And I'm going to go straight into questions to try and maximize our time this afternoon. And I will start with Jamie, if you would like to come in.
On the question I asked earlier. Should all future primary school teachers have a language qualification? And if so, at what level? And how feasible is such a proposal? And how long would it take to implement?
Do you want to go first? I think the question was covered by previous respondents this morning as well. From an employer's point of view and from COSLA's point of view, obviously we want people to come into the profession who are ready to deliver the curriculum in its entirety. And from what the GTC representative was saying earlier, it's quite clear that having teachers who are already geared up to deliver a modern language, whatever that language may be, and have the capacity to manage the classroom situation that would allow progress to be made, then that would be our view as well. At the moment, because of the situation we're in, I think there's great strengths within the modern language sector at the moment, but nevertheless, I think when we conduct an audit of the skills of existing primary school teachers, we might find that there's gaps in the skills that are there. And our view would be, instead of trying to retrofit, if you like, skills to teachers who are already teaching, we also need a supply of teachers who are capable of delivering the curriculum in its entirety. In the same way as you wouldn't expect teachers to come into a school and say, well, I can deliver the whole curriculum apart from numeracy in the future. I think the position will be that they'll be expected to deliver that element of modern language provision as well. So that's the journey I think that we're on, and I think that's the journey that is being kick-started by 1+2. So hopefully, in time, and we are planning to deliver this over 2 parliamentary terms, so it's not as if we need this in place as of this afternoon. It's a longer term game we've got to look at, and hopefully we can achieve these ambitions in our small country.
Just coming to this point, from a local authority perspective, I think it is important that the delivery of the curriculum is underpinned by a very clear and transparent strategy. And there is an expectation that very quickly local authorities move to develop new language learning strategies. My sense is that the expectation around raising the level of entry qualifications or graduating qualifications, because as has been indicated, if an aspiring primary teacher does not have at the point of entry to a course the equivalent of a higher in a modern language, the expectation is that she or he in the course of their undergraduate studies attains that qualification. That obviously has very unambiguous expectations about the capacity of the teacher education institution to deliver training to undergraduates who have entered a teacher training course without the equivalent of a higher in a modern language. I think there's a societal question that has to be answered, and obviously which would go on to underpin an emerging national implementation strategy. If we prize language learning, and not just the learning of foreign languages, then there are implications for the skills that we will seek to find in those professionals whom we would recruit to teach our children and young people. And I think it's entirely reasonable to expect teachers to contribute significantly to the linguistic development of pupils both in primary and secondary. In terms of the Curriculum for Excellence, which is badged as a transformational reform of the school curriculum in Scotland schools, there is now a professional expectation that all teachers, irrespective of their academic discipline, support linguistic numeracy developments and support young people around health and well-being. So I think it's ambitious, challenging, but deliverable. And if any of us need to be reminded how easy it is to learn a language, we simply have to walk into any Scottish school, which is a significant proportion of Polish immigrants, and observe how quickly they have acquired English. As a passionate former modern linguist, I've always been about trying to demystify the notion that learning languages is difficult. We have found ways in this and other countries of making it difficult, of not making it engaging enough, and I think that's the challenge. Can we provide a learning landscape which is rich and engaging and nurturing, and not just in terms of skills in the foreign language, but skills in one's own native language?
Can I just say, I think it's really about setting standards and setting expectations, and I don't think it's unrealistic for us to be saying that we would expect somebody to have National 5, the kind of new currency level of a qualification in a modern language before they went into initial teacher education. You know, in terms of the teachers themselves, we have to equip them with the skills that they will then need to be employed at the end of that process. And if the expectation is in schools that everybody will be delivering a modern language as part of the curriculum in the primary schools, then people have to have the correct skills in place before that to be able to then get a job at the end of their teacher education. I think that, you know, I echo everything that Neil's just said as well. I agree with everything that Neil's just said. In terms of the skill level that we have currently, I actually teach the MLPS training in Edinburgh. I was teaching my French class last night, and there's a huge range of different skills within one class that you have. Now, that can be from somebody who's done an O grade in 1984 in French, to somebody who's practically a fluent speaker, to somebody who's done a degree, to somebody who has next to no French, but is very enthusiastic. And that's the kind of level, that's the kind of playing field that you're dealing with when you're actually doing the teacher education through the local authorities. So I think to give us a kind of baseline standard for teachers would be really, really helpful in terms of taking this forward.
Can I come in here too? I'm from Dumfries and Galloway, and Dumfries and Galloway is a very rural area, and we have different issues to address in terms of modern languages down there, because we don't have access to the cultural organisations and the more cosmopolitan aspects that you get in a city like Edinburgh, for example. We've had to harness new technologies in order to be able to get to our teachers, develop new materials, but nevertheless, the standard can't be allowed to be less for our teachers simply because of those attendant issues. We have to offer the same quality as a big city like Edinburgh. We already are compromised in the languages that we teach. We can only support one major language as the L2 language in the school, and that's French. And that's because that's where our teachers have their strength. We are working to our strength, and that's what we have to do. We realise that it's not the ideal. And if more money is made available in terms of developing the L3 language as well, then we could perhaps start to branch out again. But we need to get one thing done right first, and that's our basic teacher education for those teachers. And there is a huge disparity in what is delivered across Scotland at the moment. And we know this through the organisation Koala, where there are local authority representatives. And these are just the ones that come to it. We don't know actually what's happening with the others that don't.
Yeah. Jamie, you want to come back in?
Well, I wanted to go on actually to another question.
Okay, please do.
In the written evidence from ADES, which from Neil Logue, on the role of languages in economic development, it says the actual choice of languages in a school context is not hugely important. Now, that's fine, but in the written evidence from Edinburgh Council on page 18, there is a breakdown by language, CBI, Education for Skills and Growth Survey, which was done in 2011, which shows that French 61%, German 52%, Spanish 40%, Polish 29%, going the whole way down to the bottom, which is Korean at 9%. Perhaps with Gangnam Style, it doesn't want to go up now, but the point I'm making, I think, is are there any specific languages children should be learning and why? And if I was I am a parent, and I'd probably be asking, well, I'd like the language to be important to my child's future. And you're saying in your written evidence that the actual choice of language in a school context is not hugely important. And I wondered if you'd like to follow that through.
Absolutely. The fundamental argument here is that it is much more important through school education, and this is what we have already been saying in terms of taking forward the reform of the curriculum through Curriculum for Excellence. It's much more important to instill and nurture in children and young people the appropriate range of skills, and the mantra is frequently used, skills for life, skills for learning, skills for work. There is a finite range of languages available across Scottish schools. The working group report, and I was the ADES representative on the working group, makes absolutely clear that, of course, in the immediate and medium term, we will clearly continue to have a major emphasis on the languages of our European neighbours, French, Spanish, German, Italian. From a purely economic point of view, and obviously the working group received a lot of evidence and mulled over a lot of research activity, there is clearly a macroeconomic interest in society across Scotland and the UK having the linguistic skills to engage effectively and in a rewarding way with strong or emerging strong economies. Brazil is frequently mentioned. Portuguese is therefore trotted out. I happen to be a Portuguese speaker. I speculate that there are probably only 20 or 30 other native Scots in Scotland who are Portuguese speakers. And I'm ashamed to say I don't know whether my alma mater, Glasgow University, still delivers Portuguese or not. So it's fanciful to have an ambition about languages that you pluck out of the sky without first attending to the need to create the infrastructure, the capacity, the expertise. And that's why the implementation strategy has to have a very clear sight of the various way stages, small steps becoming slightly bigger steps, quicker steps, and build upon and create a structure, or rather an infrastructure, that supports the ambitions. And therefore, teacher education, both in terms of undergraduates who may not necessarily, in the first instance, want to be teachers, but very specifically, teacher education courses have to be acquiring the language training and language teaching capacity. So what I think is more important is that, and one of a former colleague of mine, Dan Tierney, who gave evidence in January or February to this committee, reiterated throughout his contributions the need to be clear-sighted about what the objective is here. And going back to what I said earlier, for me, the objective, as a linguist, the objective should be much more about giving children the skills so that they're confident, fearless, encouraged and motivated about tackling a language as and when they need to tackle or acquire a language through what I think we've said in the ADES paper, through professional or personal circumstances. So in a sense, it doesn't matter whether you leave a Scottish school having a confident grasp of Spanish or Italian or French. You will have acquired skills that will serve you well as you move to another language. One of my own children is a mechanical engineer who works globally. He's currently perforce learning a bit of Azerbaijani. Not because he wants to sing in the next European or Eurovision Song Contest, but because his company does a lot of work in Baku. Now, he was a relatively timid, but given his father's particular interest in demeanour, but was eventually conscripted into believing that languages were important. And I think language simply has to be seen and valued as an important life skill, and across a range of occupations, an important ancillary skill which may be, not necessarily will be, may be called into use. Of course, there are other justifications for speaking languages. I got a great kick from being able to speak to, a farmer in northwest Portugal, southeast Spain, etc., etc. There's immense personal satisfaction, and we need somehow or other to convince pupils, open their minds, open their eyes, widen their horizons, and raise their ambitions and expectations, and thereby change the learning as well as the teaching landscape. Hopefully that's answered your question.
Yeah. And I just want to come back to Neil. You used a lot of buzzwords there and fine language, but what you haven't told me is how we get there. Can you actually indicate your view on how we get there?
Well, the question,
because we know that language is the language we want to find out is how we get there.
Well, the question that I was asked was a question about what I thought should whether an individual language or other was important and which languages.
Yes.
What I did indicate is that we will have to, in terms of a national strategy, have very clear wastages and build incrementally from one wastage to another in terms of here's where we want to be in a year's time, 2 years' time. Are we serious about transforming as never before? And in Scotland, we have been here before. We were here in 1989. And if we are serious about transforming the language learning landscape, then it's very much about growing capacity and expertise within the universities, within the teacher education institutions, and having joined up thinking between government and local authority, indeed across authorities, about what is important and what concretely each authority, and possibly given how hard times are and are going to get even harder, I think it will be important, and it's hinted at in the working group's report, authorities will have to work together as well as working with the university sector and working with the cultural organisations. I don't have the answers. As you can gather, I have the dream, but I've had it for 20 odd years.
You've got close to that. Thank you for that. Claire, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, it was a very quick supplementary on that area, because we have quite, as you say, Professor Tierney was very focused on the language selection issue, but we've also had a lot of evidence about the change in the learning behaviour, the change in the brain, and because of the age at which we're starting in teaching children. So although, and the concern from the parent this morning about there's no point in doing a language at primary school if it can't be done at secondary school, and I want just a quick clarification, because from the evidence I've given, I would say my opinion would be that the 2+1 model stands, and it's even if that articulation can't be made into secondary school, the capacity building, the change in the learning capacity of the child, and the way the brain actually then can deal with languages is such that the 2+ model stands alone, even if that articulation to secondary can't be achieved.
I agree. I think continuity, progression and sustaining engagement with an individual language would be ideal. I'm not, as a former professional linguist, overly depressed at the possibility that may sometimes not happen. And the reason why I'm not depressed is, as I've already explained and as you have very eloquently picked up on, it is much more important that young people acquire the skills to learn a language. Those are transferable. In my own experience as a pupil, I started in one secondary school, did Italian. I moved in third year. School didn't do Italian. I started Spanish. But the plasticity of a young child's brain is such that young children don't ask themselves, is this hard or is it difficult? They simply pick up a language. We somehow or other have managed, despite our best efforts, we've managed to instill a lack of confidence about learning languages, and we've got to reverse that mindset and that environment, that landscape.
Thank you.
Yes.
ask Councillor Chapman for just a little more comment on the question of ring fencing of local government resources in relation to spending on projects such as these. In your written submission, you say that COSLA doesn't support ring fencing. In relation to issues that we were touching on in the first session on continuity and transition, I think that ring fencing, from where I sit, has some advantages. Would you just like to kind of comment further on that issue?
Yeah, I mean, I think we welcome the move to take away ring fencing from local authority funding in general. There's obviously through the current policy on languages has been pursued, a great deal of focus on modern languages going forward, and I know Mr. Malik was looking maybe for some sort of silver bullet to say if we do this then all will be delivered, but there's such a wide range of different strategies that I think local authorities have to adopt to deliver this programme successfully. The government already said that while they're supporting the pilot, followed by the £4 million in this financial year to support languages. That's the kind of sort of approach that we would want to see as well. But it needs to be taken as a total package for local government. I think there'll be sufficient emphasis and sufficient momentum behind the policy to make sure that there's no local authority across Scotland that's not putting a larger and greater emphasis on the teaching of modern languages. But at the same time, there's also an emphasis on, as we heard before, science and maths and literacy and so on. So, it's a fairly complex picture. But nevertheless, we wouldn't want to see ring fencing being reintroduced. But at the same time, the policy of the government is such that we would be obliged to follow that guidance that they've given and put as much effort into extending modern languages as we possibly can.
Okay. Billy, you wanted to come in?
Yes, please, Convener. Thanks very much. Could I ask a wee bit more about the transition from primary to secondary? I mean, we can envisage a whole load of our youngsters coming out of the primary schools with smatterings of Spanish, maybe Mandarin, maybe French, maybe even Catalan if the kids want to play for Barcelona. The point that Neil Logue made, I think, was echoed by, was it Luca Tomasi, a previous committee convener, who seemed to say that it doesn't really matter what the languages are as long as they have a language or a couple of languages. Does the panel agree with that? And can I ask you about local authorities and their preparedness for the curriculum for excellence and the flexibility and so on? And it's back to a point that Neil Logue made about mechanical engineering and science. Is there enough awareness, do you think, amongst our youngsters who are studying science and engineering that they should be thinking about combining that with a language? And do you think we're ready enough in the local authorities to offer that within curriculum for excellence?
I think if I just start on your last point, I think in terms of local authorities' readiness, it really comes from a top-down commitment in terms of the commitment that's already been made over the past few years with the introduction to curriculum for excellence from local authorities. I think I would be right in saying that it's very varied across the country. I can only really talk in terms of City of Edinburgh, of course, but I think one of the things that's made a really big difference is having me in post, not just because it was me, but making the commitment to having a dedicated languages person who would coordinate and lead modern languages for City of Edinburgh. That isn't the case across Scotland. And I think the level of readiness is very, very varied. I think I'd be right in saying that. What were your other points? Sorry.
The languages coming out of primary, do we need to replicate those languages at secondary? Because realistically, we can't expect every secondary to deliver every language.
I think again that
through,
that comes back to the geography of a particular local authority as well. Obviously, in Edinburgh, we're very well placed in terms of the geography of our clusters, and a cluster approach is now embedded across the city, whereby you would have agreement with the secondary and the associate primaries as to which languages, and that may be plural, it may be more than one language, is being delivered. So, for example, we might have a rolling programme of French and German, and that would be then continued on into the secondary. Where that doesn't necessarily follow through would be if a pupil comes from out with that cluster and then joins the secondary at first year, and that can quite often be the case. But secondaries have the responsibility to then put something into place to deal with pupils who may not have done that language previously. I would say from City of Edinburgh's perspective that is embedded across the city now, that approach. But I don't think that would necessarily be the case across the whole of Scotland. Just to say about in terms of the language as well, I fully echo what Neil's said as well, that really the experience of language learning and giving people the skills, giving our learners the skills to then become lifelong language learners as well, not just when they're in school, is really crucial. The point of progression, I think that it's preferable. If you can have that continuity, you can have that progression, it's certainly preferable than having an interruption, but it's just not always possible to avoid that.
Views from other members, please.
In Dumfries and Galloway, we largely teach French, but there are 4 schools that do German. And we have just heard this week that the secondary school is not any longer going to be offering German in S1, which then means that the ideal scenario of them carrying on the language through primary, through to the end of broad general education, will not happen in that instance. And that's 2 head teachers who've made decisions. One will not change and the other one doesn't want to offer, and we will come up against that. So they have to resolve that themselves. I don't really think that's something that we could insist upon, but it's well indicated in the Curriculum for Excellence, building the curriculum, that the same language, the L2 language it's referred to, the main language that's carried on from primary 1, if it's primary 1 or P6, is carried on to the end of the broad general education phase. And that is what my understanding is that HMIE expect to see as well.
Can I just confirm that I do agree with myself? I agree with the view that ultimately it is unusual for those who know me. Whilst I believe, if you like, philosophically, that ultimately it matters not what language is studied, of course, from a practical point of view, as a local authority, Director of Education, I would move heaven and earth to try and make sure that continuity and progression was made possible. But as this committee has been advised by previous witnesses, discontinuity has been a frequent feature, largely to do with the movement of teachers. So a school can find itself in a situation over a matter of weeks, losing, let's say, 2 Spanish teachers and not being able to recruit to that. The only way to obviate the difficulties around, or the challenges around continuity, is for an authority, and that this has to come from a strategy rather than from incidental discussions involving only individual head teachers, has a strategy which is designed to make sure that you have a broadly equipped language teaching workforce. And what that means in essence is, if you have a teacher who's a modern languages graduate, but only a graduate in one language, you do everything possible to support and encourage that teacher to acquire, through further study, supported by the authority, part of their contractual professional learning, another language. That approach across Scotland will have to be addressed vigorously and seriously in order to begin to have the capacity to sustain a commitment to progression and continuity. And likewise, from a national perspective, in terms of planning the teacher workforce of the future, the training of aspiring primary teachers has to be carefully considered so that we get the right diversified balance across those languages which, as a society in Scotland, we prize and we want to be available for our children and young people.
Nicholas, you wanted to come back in?
Just a very quick point. I think other people made the reference to clusters. I think that's really school clusters, and I think that's really important. You know, the progression that we see from, well, curriculum for excellence is now 3 to 18. So, you know, we should be looking at that experience, that educational experience for a child in its entirety. And I've no doubt that as more schools become more skilled at working in a more collegiate way across a whole cluster and coming up with that strategy for modern languages or whatever other subjects they want to develop. That then allows, for example, we're talking about maybe teachers who we know are going to retire in 2 or 3 years' time. How does that cluster start to make arrangements now for that eventuality happening, and maybe to cover some of the difficulties that might bring? Because, as we've said before, we don't have a fully skilled workforce to deliver the curriculum as a whole across all primaries. I think the other important point that Willie made was about, should this be taken into other spheres of the curriculum, for example, science and engineering. And I think the CBI have often complained that not enough children leave school with sufficient language skills. But again, that's something when we're talking about involvement of others. That's maybe something that could be brought into the classroom. There's in my own area, and I've got quite a lot of heavy engineering companies, and they look for language skills in German because that's where their main markets tend to be. So it would be absolutely fantastic if some of their employees could give up maybe a little bit of their time to come in and explain, not just about engineering, but the fact that they need to go to Munich or wherever to explain their ideas in German or their pidgin English. So, I think there's a lot of scope there for real flexibility, but, it's about what happens on the ground, and we can't just allow ad hoc decisions to drive the policy. It needs to be a definite strategy that each cluster adopts, and, I think the idea of having it supported from the very top in the educational authority is really important as well. There needs to be a great sense of direction of where we're going with this.
Douglas, just on that point, if I may, you've just heard that 2 primary schools or primary schools who are currently offering languages will not get them in the secondary school, possibly in the same cluster, which is very unhelpful at best. But the question I was going to ask yourself, with your expertise, is one, can the council actually intervene in issues like that? The chief exec or the director of education can intervene to try and assist the school overcome that difficulty, is one point. And the second is, how many periods are we expecting our children to do languages in primary schools, and what will then have to give to allow that to happen? Because so far no one's actually mentioned what will have to give to allow for languages to take place. Could you...
Yeah, I think the first thing is always down to the individual local authority, and I think that's probably the answer you'd expect. But I think going back to my point about there needs to be an overarching strategy within the local authority to say this is what the important steps we need to take in developing modern languages, and making sure that when children move between primary and secondary, that's a smooth as transition as you can possibly manage, given the resources that you have. The second point, sorry, can you just run past me again? Was
in terms of when we are now undertaking languages, a lot of schools at the moment perhaps are not even doing any language at all. Now, if we're expecting them to teach languages 2 periods or 4 periods a week, what will have to give for that to take place?
Well,
and is there any danger of us?
Maybe Neil and the other members are more sort of in a better position to explain that. But my understanding is that the more you can embed languages as part of the normal school day, and I think some of the experiences that those who visited, it was Dalmarnock, was it? And I know that Mr Campbell's been out to see schools in Fife. I think within the school day, not only is there a sense of fun about learning languages, and that's something that we sometimes forget, that a lot of young people, especially at primary, find it really enjoyable, and they get a great sense of achievement from learning a language.
I was just trying to
identify. But the other thing is there's no reason why other elements of the curriculum can't be taught, maybe mathematics or whatever, using a foreign language, and that brings a certain enjoyment level as well, I suppose, to the lesson. But I'm sure Anne and others will.
I could tell you what we do in our region, if that's any help. Please. We have recommended 45 minutes to an hour per week for a P6 or P7 class in order to progress the language, but included within the wider curriculum that wherever possible the language is integrated. For example, if you're doing some maths or if you're doing some kind of history work or whatever, that you integrate the language where possible, and particularly in English language where you're making links constantly. Mm-hmm. But that again takes a measure of skill from the primary teacher. Indeed. And it is not all of them that are able to do that at this juncture. Yes. But we do look for 45 minutes to an hour every week. Obviously things get in the way of that. Would you agree with that, Anne?
Yeah. In terms of time allocations, at the moment there are no time allocations for modern languages under Curriculum for Excellence. That was something which was previously in place with 5 to 14, and the allocation worked out at roughly about 45 minutes a week to an hour in P6 and P7. The entitlement of pupils is now to have modern languages from P6 onwards, so P6 till the end of S3. And that, from our perspective, that's pretty much embedded across the city. There are pockets where it doesn't happen as well as it should. And there are, at the other extreme, we've got places where it's happening perhaps from primary 1 at the moment. There's really, it's a mixture, like Janice was saying, between this kind of idea of the time allocation and also encouraging schools to try and embed the language as much as possible. There's been some mention earlier about teaching different curricular areas in the foreign language. I mean, really what you're talking about when you're looking at that as a kind of immersion approach to learning. And I think, we've got to be realistic in terms of what we're able to achieve within the timescales that we've got and with the funding that we've got. We're not going to get to the stage where we have fluent speakers over the next 7 years who are able to deliver history in French, for example. What you can do is you can embed things like simple daily routine songs at the start of the day. You can embed language in the kind of daily routine, the daily life of the school. And that's the kind of direction I think we would be going in terms of our strategy in Edinburgh. Just to say about the idea of the time allocation as well, there's currently a bit of an issue with primary 7 in a lot of schools, and what you tend to hear from a lot of primary teachers is, and if I had a pound for every time I'd heard this, that there's just no time in primary 7. The curriculum in primary 7 is very, very busy. There's a lot of transition activities. There's things like cycling proficiency, and the children tend to be out of class quite a lot. And modern languages, for whatever reason, seems to be the first thing to go to make room for these other areas. So quite often when we're talking about time allocations for modern languages, it's time allocations in inverted commas. What we're looking to encourage people to do as a kind of first stage for implementation of 1+2 is start to look at a phased approach. So to look at starting from primary 5 onwards. And that would then bring modern languages, first of all, into line with the other curricular areas, whereby they would be doing level 2 experiences and outcomes under Curriculum for Excellence from primary 5 through to primary 7. And I think that would give us a good starting point. To work towards that would allow us a bit more robustness, a bit more rigour in terms of the language input that they're getting at the moment.
Do you think it would be helpful if there was a time frame for all schools throughout Scotland in terms of minimum times? And that way it would take away the guesswork from many of the authorities?
Well, that's a position that used to prevail. In fact, that there was a clear time frame, a time allocation for every area of the curriculum. The Inspectorate, Learning Teaching Scotland have moved away from that, and of course now both bodies find themselves in a new organisation, Education Scotland. As the ADES paper has indicated, there are only 2 prescriptions around time allocation in the curriculum in Scotland, and those prescriptions relate to physical education and religious and moral education. Going back to the very words you used in your question, I don't think it's what will be lost that will have to be moved. It's a case of if children are not experiencing a foreign language at the moment, then it's reasonable, given the ambitions around language learning, to surmise that the curriculum at present is insufficiently broad and rich. and that by giving them a language, what you're actually doing is increasing the richness of their experiences as a learner. And although I'm a director of education, if I were a teacher of language in school, that's exactly what I'd be saying to my head teacher, to get as much time as I could. But colleagues have answered exactly in relation to the answers about primary experience that echoes the experience in my own authority, Angus. I think it's worthwhile pointing out, and it's an important recommendation the Languages Working Group come up with, recommendation 6 recommended that there be regular planned exposure. And I think the ambition and expectation is there that the language experience should not come in one weekly dollop. One 45-minute or 1 hour, it should be spread over. And if it's 2 or 3 times, it's maybe more than 3 times 10 or 20 minutes. But again, one way of making sure that there is regular exposure is to use the language for very specific purposes and embed it in the ways that my colleagues have described.
Jamie, you wanted to come in and then?
Yes. Well, it was just to pick up on something that Janice Byers said about the practical problem which she faced over the German not being carried on into secondary school, which I think is a very important point. And I mean, do you think in that case that we should really be having, rather than have a sort of local authority strategy on this, that we ought to have a national strategy? And in which case, how prescriptive should that national strategy be?
Well, I personally feel that head teachers need to have strong guidance on that one. You're talking about potentially, if this were a few years down the line, that would be 7 years of a language suddenly stopping, and children going into a group where they were complete beginners. They would be disadvantaged on so many counts.
I can imagine fury with pupils and
Utterly.
parents and teachers.
And even just now, before that, there's a lot of fury going on. But the thing is, as it stands at the moment, it's head teachers and clusters that make the decision. And that cluster just so happened that the majority do French. Interestingly, that was the cluster that was taken as the model back in 1989 at the end of the first foray into modern languages. It was that model that was picked as the national model from Dumfries and Galloway, German from Annan. And that is the model that as soon as the support was pulled, switched to French at the drop of a hat. Only 4 schools, I think, stayed with it, and we've now lost all save 2. Which is just a sideline as a bit of information, but it's worth bearing that in mind when looking at other things. But yes, there needs to be strong guidelines, because that's a decision the primary head teachers don't wish to change, and indeed why should they, because it was a cluster arrangement. The secondary head has decided that this is going to happen. There is no staffing reason for it, it's just going to happen. And we are not currently giving out there is no advice on that one. It's a cluster decision is where it's left. So, I mean, I don't really know where we would go on that one at this stage of the game.
No, thank you for sharing that with us, and I'm sure there will be people who take it up to try and support you on that one. I don't want to make that the issue of the meeting today. And I'll ask Roddy to come in at this stage.
And it's a slightly different question. It's kind of utilising people in the community. I noticed that in the COSLA submission you support that people who have foreign languages in the community coming in and using them in school. I'm not sure from Neil Wilgie's submission whether you take that on board, and whether you've actually kind of costed, in inverted commas, the costs of expansion of modern languages departments in universities and things. You talk about the need for a major expansion, so perhaps you would comment on that.
Well, the need for the major, without a major expansion in capacity, in teaching capacity and learning capacity in university, we will not develop the teachers of the future that can deliver this ambitious strategy. Costings for that expansion clearly will have to be done by universities themselves, but it does strike me that the local authorities will be engaged with each one of the 35 recommendations of the working group, including the recommendations which just says universities should work closely together. Essentially, what you're talking about, the costs of recruiting linguists in universities who can deliver language teaching and provide language learning programs, both to standard university undergraduates, but also, as I said earlier, to aspiring primary teachers. Clearly, if one wants to extend the range of languages available in Scotland schools, that expansion will have to be even more diversified. Because at the moment, it's ironic that at a time when we have a welcome from a linguist point of view, new departure, new set of ambitions for modern languages, that university language departments are in decline. As the ADES paper says, language learning is extinct in the further education sector. So unless every part of the educational landscape in Jigsaw works together through a national implementation approach or strategy, we're not going to push forward effectively on these ambitions. But quite clearly, what universities need to do to expand their undergraduate provision is entirely a matter for them and how to cost it.
What about utilising people in the community who have foreign languages as their mother tongue? Are you in favour of that, or?
I'm in favour of, as a local authority, Director of Education and former model linguist, getting pupils to have as much quality exposure to another language. Certainly in our authority, there's an awful lot of engagement with Polish parents who volunteer, who act in support of the language curriculum in a number of ways. And as we heard from Richard TALLARON earlier, French nationals who are living in this country will frequently volunteer to support language learning. It doesn't follow that because you speak a language, you will necessarily be able to support children in learning that language in a school environment. And what's absolutely crucial is, as well as the training and the nurturing of expertise has to have a dual focus. Yes, a focus around giving teachers the linguistic skills, but they have to have the pedagogical skills as well. You have to know how to teach a language in an engaging fashion in ways that motivate young people. And it doesn't follow because you speak a language, you can necessarily instill excitement or an appetite in young people to learn the language of which you're a native speaker. So there has to be a strong commitment to linguistic training, but also pedagogical training.
Okay. Thank you very much. Claire, would you want to come?
Yes, I'd like to just touch on the funding issues that have been in quite a number of the submissions. And I suppose the only indication we've had today is the working group that said that it would need it to be 2 or 3 times. We're talking about a grain of sand 2 or 3 times isn't much, but if you're talking about the volume of water in Loch Lomond, you know, the differential becomes huge, so that seems quite arbitrary. So what I really want to get to is whether you're aware of any really substantial financial analysis that has gone on about costs of implementation and whether there is likely to be a shortfall.
No, I'm not aware of any serious national exercise to date. In terms of local authorities, obviously Recommendation 24 exhorts local authorities to undertake an audit. That audit will necessarily throw up the financial implications of taking forward the recommendations of the working group report. But perhaps it's useful if I just run through what the sources of costs might be. In order to train teachers who are already practicing teachers, unless you're training them out of hours or during the holidays, there are backfill costs. To release a teacher from a Scottish classroom for a full day will cost a local authority on average £166 per day. We in Angus have our own in-house MLPS training programme, just as Edinburgh City Council has. We currently have 12 teachers undertaking that training. The cost of the training is £21,000 a year. And that's broken down into supply costs, venue costs, catering costs, trainer costs, and a level of input from a foreign language assistant. In Scotland, as we speak this morning, there are 69 foreign language assistants. 12 of them are employed by Angus Council at roughly £8,000 per head, so call that £96,000. In terms of releasing a teacher such as Anne to support modern languages provision in Edinburgh, the annual cost to release a teacher, and this is inclusive of on costs, is, and I have it in front of me here, £42,000. That's at the top of the teacher scale. That is inclusive of on costs. So those values can be multiplied in different ways according to need. Different authorities will have different costs depending upon where they are at the moment. So, for example, if you have a secondary school, and I know this is inquiring to primary, but just with reference to secondary, if in a secondary school the average uptake after second year for the past 3 years has been 25 or 30%, the expectation now is nationally that the uptake will be 100%. To bridge that gap, it's almost inevitable that school will have to recruit more languages teachers. That wouldn't necessarily be a net cost to the authority, because within the school's overall staffing entitlement, the curriculum would be adjusted, and if you brought in a languages teacher, you might, terrible word between heavy quotes, lose a teacher, and I'll say of X, in case someone thought I had an agenda. Beyond that, the costs, going back to the other questions about the costs that will fall to and must fall to universities, is what costs will universities have to meet in order to enhance in an appropriate and fit for purpose way their capacity to deliver the training that's needed, and indeed to deliver the range of languages for which training is needed.
If I may add to that as well, I think your question was, has there been any analysis done? I think Neil's right to say no, there's not a body of work now to the moment, but certainly in our discussions with the Scottish Government, that we have a commitment on their part to work certainly with ourselves to really work up what the ongoing costs will be beyond next year. So we have the agreement of 4 million funding for 13-14, but beyond that, there isn't a sort of figure that we could give as to what the ongoing cost would be, but that has to be established, and that's an agreement which we've got with Scottish Government that we would establish that in some detail.
Thank you very much. I'm sad to say that we've come to the time where we've run out of time. But before I finish off, I'll just request Douglas, if Douglas can support Janice in speaking to some of your colleagues to see if you can overcome this difficulty. Oh, I beg your pardon. I'll let you come in.
Thanks,
if you could support, speak to some of your colleagues to see if you can overcome this difficulty. It will show that we can fix things in Scotland if you're successful, and I wish you luck with that. I hadn't realised that Helen wanted to come in, so I'll allow her in as a last question.
Thanks very much, Convener. It's to continue with this funding, and you would hear my questions to the last session. I just wondered if you would maybe like to come in on the general issues about funding from the European level, because I think that this is something that's really important, something that in a paper to our committee previously, it's a public paper, anyone of you can see it online. What that paper has told us is that there's a great dearth of information about the actual funding, who's claiming that funding, who's not claiming that funding. But the bottom line appears to be, from the information that we have to date, is that there is money to be claimed in Brussels that in Scotland, in all ranges of our life in Scotland, we're simply not claiming. Now, it would have said to me that here is a classic case for languages, and something that the Commission and the Parliament and Council of Ministers are all trying to really promote this. Here's a classic case of, funding is there. So how can we actually get all the professionals to work together, maybe at different levels or maybe one big working group, but there needs to be very dedicated time to focusing on the specific issue of drawing down that funding, because it takes a time to build up the knowledge and the expertise. But if you leave it to somebody else, we all know the saying, oh, somebody else is doing it, and it turns up that actually nobody else has done it, and that's what has happened in Scotland.
I think this comes back to the point of having somebody who's leading in modern languages locally, or if it's leading on something like the funding nationally. We've done quite a lot of work to promote the Comenius funding, for example, in Edinburgh, and I promote that through the MLPS and through my primary networks across Edinburgh. I've worked with Richard TALLARON to promote the French immersion and Spanish immersion courses. We've got 20 teachers signed up to do that through Le Français en Écosse this year, and then there may be far more than that across the city that we don't know of. We also are planning a Comenius application at the moment to run a joint project with Madrid, and that would be for one of our largest clusters in Edinburgh. That would be a joint Spanish-English project to provide MLPS training for the staff and to provide exchanges for the pupils. So there are different ways that we're accessing the funding, but that's not to say that we're aware of everything that's out there. But I think where it's not being accessed, it's because people aren't aware of what's available.
Yes.
Maybe there's a stronger role for COSLA in the process. I think from my experience that a lot of partnership agreements that are made to access European funding, I think the experience I've had is that where Scotland or a Scottish local authority, for example, is one of the partners, then that is seen as a very strong asset by other parts of the European Union. And we have a very active office in Brussels in the Scotland House, and that's something that I think we could pursue, by today, to make sure that some of the information that is available is maybe hammered home a bit more enthusiastically across the range of local authorities who are maybe not that well involved at the moment.
I may just add there that every authority obviously has an external funding officer. Those external funding officers can work together, but as well as that work, from an ADES perspective, we're delighted that the government has very quickly indicated its willingness to sit down and discuss with COSLA and with ADES the resource implications of this very ambitious commitment to change the language learning landscape. As I have hinted at, if not actually said earlier in some of my contributions, given the fiscal challenges which all authorities in the country as a whole is facing at the moment, ADES is determined to ensure that, as never before, authorities work more closely together and pool their efforts, including efforts around delivering training, and those efforts must include efforts to come up with, if you will, a consortium approach to securing whatever funding is out there.
Yeah, I think yes, that's absolutely very helpful. Whilst I think the government has the overarching responsibility because it's the government's championing this cause, but I think the idea of COSLA and us getting involved is a good one, and I'm sure our convener will be delighted with this voluntary support that's being offered today. All it leaves for me to is thank the panel very much for your participation this morning, and it's been very helpful and very positive, and I hope that your local issues can be resolved as a matter of urgency. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'll have a short break now to allow the visitors to leave. And thank you very much. We are going to go on to the next item on the agenda, which is item number 2. We're going to let Roderick Campbell give us a feedback of his visit to the school. Roderick, the floor is yours. If you could give us
Good. Yeah, I visited 2 schools on Monday. Balmerino Primary School, which is in Goodrin, in the How of Fife, which is a small rural school. I was expecting to see some examples of French tuition. In actual fact, we did see some examples of French, but that was in the nursery class. What was quite apparent was actually throughout the school, languages were being taught at various stages, and we saw P4 and 5, and they were they were involved in doing some French, some Spanish, and some Mandarin. The children, I think, at that school found Mandarin much more difficult than French, but they seemed to enjoy it. There seemed to be a very good teaching assistant who was there coming in, which was a benefit. And in the afternoon, we went on to visit Lucas Primary School, and the focus there was very much on Mandarin, although the Mandarin was taught, I think, from primary 4, is that right? And French was only commenced in primary 6. But we did, again, focus primarily on that, although I did meet a child in the pupil forum who did both. What was quite apparent was that both the children and the parents, who we also met, were all very enthusiastic about language tuition generally, and there was no resistance to Mandarin in particular. Everyone seemed to recognise its potential big importance in the world in which we live, even though it might be slightly more difficult. One of the things that came across is that there was a reasonably good approach to continuity there, in terms of that the school was in the Madras cluster. Madras is in St Andrews, which has a big emphasis on Mandarin teaching as well as on French. So the issues which we've been touching on in the sessions about continuity and transition seem to be less of an issue in the schools that we visited in Fife. Yeah, I think obviously I did get the impression that the Mandarin teaching was kind of dependent on individuals concerned. I think there was about 13 Mandarin teachers in Scottish schools. I think I heard that on the questions yesterday. I think that came out. Yeah, and so some criticisms of the Scottish government supported intranet system from both schools. Neither of them thought that was particularly helpful. But I think both schools thought that use of technology and things to support language tuition was quite important, as was kind of software which had games in, and also there was a strong recognition that you could use language teaching in other things, not specifically in the language classes, like that in other lessons they were using, they could write the name and the date in a foreign language, and they could use language in sporting events and other matters. Yeah, and also a general recognition, I think, that early learning, starting the sooner the better, was the best way to approach languages. It has to be said that in terms of for the younger groups, the teaching of Mandarin was focused primarily on culture and history and songs, I think it was appreciated that Mandarin is quite a difficult language, and that they didn't overdo the kind of familiarity with the symbols of Mandarin, as it were, at the early stage. Which, looking at the language myself, I can understand. But I was impressed by the amount of enthusiasm there was, full stop. Obviously, you kind of appreciate that that's what you would get in schools that are keen on. We obviously didn't visit schools where kind of languages were of no real interest to the headmistress. So you obviously get a more positive version in visiting schools like that. But it was useful all the same. It was interesting. We met one set of parents, one girl who was fluent in Finnish and English at home, but she was also learning Mandarin. But I think from that background, I think appreciation of learning languages is perhaps a very easy sell. So that was roughly it, I think.
Thank you very much for that. Have we got any questions?
More a comment, if I may, convener. And I mean, I think what this has taught, particularly myself, looking at the experience with Roderick, is that you're looking at Fife as an entity. And what it's highlighted for me is that despite intensive effort by myself and my team in my office to visit a school within my constituency that teaches languages, what it's highlighted is the difference between North East Fife, which I think Roderick would agree is the more affluent area, University Town of St Andrews and so on, and the area that I represent, which I think people will perhaps know, has within it towns and villages that are amongst the most disadvantaged in the whole of Scotland. And it's interesting that in speaking to some of those teachers in the schools, what they're saying that the curriculum for excellence has been so challenging for them that they have not had the time to be able to commit to this. Now, I am not able to comment on that because I don't have that knowledge and experience, but I think it's interesting just to note that, because it does mean that the children in the more disadvantaged parts of Scotland are suffering at the moment, and some special thought needs to be given to that particular aspect.
Can I just comment on that? Well, it's the same local authority. I appreciate that standards, social standards, and amount of deprivation varies considerably in Fife, but when we're talking about kind of giving things, if you're proceeding with this scheme, leaving it to kind of local circumstances, I wonder how that will work in practice unless there's some pretty strong guidelines from on high.
Well, that's why I would actually support some of the comments that we've heard from witnesses today, that it has to be a national strategy with strong guidance. But, you know, we're not at the point of coming to a conclusion. We've still more witnesses to hear. But that's certainly the opinion I'm beginning to form anyway, because it does seem that you've got all sorts of problems emerging. But, yes.
I think it's challenges rather than problems, but I'm not sure anybody's presented us with the challenge that we can't overcome. Hopefully we will overcome those challenges. But thank you very much for that verbal report. Can we note the report, verbal report? Yep. Thank you very much. Thank you for giving us that report. And we'll go on to item number 3, which is the Brussels Bulletin, and I'm going to ask Ian to talk us through it, please.
I'll be very brief. There are a couple of things in here just to draw your attention to first before I go into the big part. Tomorrow there is an event on EU funding which may be of interest to some of the members around the table, and the details are in the back end of the bulletin. 22nd of February, Grand Central Hotel in Glasgow. So that might be of interest to some. A couple of other things just around the edges here. The first 1 million signature petition has been received, and again it's touching upon water as a human right. You might remember that it had been expected that the first petition would be actually one concerning the 2 homes of the European Parliament, but because of various rule adjustments that's not managed to meet the criteria yet. The big issue in here this week, of course, is the multi-annual financial framework. Now, the headline figure has gone down. It has been reduced. So it's the first reduction in the overall EU budget that there has been. What I've done is in the annex at the back given a full breakdown of the figures. And what I've also done is I've also put in how the budget itself has evolved. So what you'll see in the figures is the current budget covering the years 2007 to 2013. And then as you go from across the page, these are each of the attempts to secure agreement until you get to the final deal. So it's important again to note that that final deal is amongst the member states. It's not yet involved the European Parliament. And I would draw your attention to the joint letter written by the 4 leaders of the groups of the European Parliament who were clearly not happy, full stop. They do not believe this is a good deal at all. And given that the Parliament itself must actually affirm this deal, they hold quite a strong negotiating position to try and secure adjustment. A couple of things that I want to just draw attention to within the document. It's important when trying to compare with the final deal with the current levels. That's not very helpful. What it's useful to sometimes look at instead is, if you like, the difference between the outcome just now and the earlier proposals. And one thing I know which is of concern to several members around the table would be the Connecting Europe facility. So although that has gone up by 140% from the current allocation, actually it's received more or less a cut of 30% from the first proposal. And importantly, and I know that broadband has been an issue, Willie and Jamie, for you, that's gone down by 86%. So you begin to see again where some of the deals have been done here to cut things out in order to ring fence what were deemed to be the important things, which of course would have been the agricultural funding and the broader cohesion structural funding. So a lot of, there has been a lot of give in the areas which this committee has taken a strong interest in.
Any comments? Yes.
Yes, I mean, I think, though, that having seen some of the figures, not just in the bulletin but elsewhere, I mean, one of the things we probably should be quite pleased about is that Horizon 2020 monies, although it's been cut from what the projected budget hoped to be, I think that was up to 80 billion that they were looking at, but that's actually now at 71, which is actually an increase of where we're at 55 billion. So that's actually a good news story. And I think the worry for farming in Scotland would be the cut in the common agricultural policy monies, and I think that obviously presents challenges to the remote and rural areas. But we've always known that reforming CAP has been something that's been on the agenda of many politicians across Europe. But I share the concerns of Willie and Jamie about the broadband, because I think that that's something that, looking to the future, it's something that we do really want to work very hard at. But I hope, having said that, we'll still take advantage of, I think, you keep telling us it's £28 billion that's still available to the end of this financial year. So I think that it's down to us, Willie and Jimmy and myself and others, to really put pressure on people out there to actually access this £28 billion that's available across Europe in the current financial year for the more remote and rural areas. And I hope this committee could give some priority to that specific piece of work as to see what we can do to actually generate activity amongst the providers, the private sector and government direction and so on, because I think that's really important for the future of...
I wonder whether that would be, if we were to approach the appropriate committees to pursue that, yes, on our behalf, and that way everybody's being...
Yeah, but I'm just mindful, convener,
yes,
that it comes back to what I was saying, yes, earlier. If we all think somebody else is doing it and they've not got the same passion or commitment that the members on this committee have got, then it just might not get the commitment that it needs to get. So I think
if we draw the attention to the committee's conveners, I think
we can do both those things. We can make sure the infrastructure committee, which is leading on this issue, is and has already declared an interest in this, is going to take it forward. And of course, we'll bring back information to this committee as well to ensure that nothing slips through the cracks.
Good.
Claire, do you want to comment?
Yes, obviously there was quite a bit of coverage yesterday morning for the Deputy First Minister talking about the change in the allocation mechanism, and it being, I understand as it's skewed towards population areas rather than on a geographic basis, and the figures that were being given was up to a 30% cut in some of the areas for Scotland, and I just wondered if you could maybe give us more information on that area.
Yes, and what I've given you here is the settlement at a European level. Now, once the figures then come down to the member state level, there are particular regulations which govern the allocation of those. Quite often those are, if you like, domestically determined, insofar as within the broad guidelines they are domestically determined. And that's why I think that the discussion was where the Deputy First Minister was able to say this is an issue where progress can be made. I have a suspicion, however, that it will be difficult to make that progress until the European Parliament made very clear what the figures look like, because I don't think the Parliament are going to enjoy any of some of these figures, and I think they will definitely want to have those adjusted. However, I don't doubt that the negotiations within the UK between all the constituent parts will be ongoing to ensure that nobody loses out to the degree which was being suggested.
Thank you.
Let Willie come in, and then I'll come back to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Convener. I think, I'm conscious of the time that we have at the committee this morning, and I would probably appreciate a better chance at the next committee, perhaps, to look at some of the implications of this in more detail, and perhaps even to invite the Cabinet Secretary to brief the committee on the potential implications of the 86% reduction in the telecoms budget is absolutely staggering. But it tells me it's kind of typical, I'm afraid, when you've got IT issues like this that are not fully understood by ordinary members in whatever parliament. Sometimes it's an easy hit but the implications of this are quite serious, I think. And I think we should take an opportunity to flesh that out, convener, in a bit more detail, and it would be a suggestion, perhaps, if we could even invite the Cabinet Secretary to come and
What I could do is actually refer it back to the next meeting and let us have another airing of that, and then make a decision thereafter, if that's the route we want to go down.
It's pretty vital. We've only got 1 year now to draw it down.
But I think there's a timescale issue here, because there's two issues. There's the money that's available at the moment, and that's money that Jimmy's quite rightly talking about, and we have to get that money down as much as we can. But I think the issue that Willie raises is really important, because what that's saying is that my question is, what's the timescale for this? When will the European Parliament make its decisions? Because I think we need to lobby like mad to the European parliamentarians that this is an area that we're extremely upset about. Now, they may or may not make a change, but if you didn't try, you'll not get. So I think that this committee and we as politicians individually should be doing what we can behind the scenes to try and get some change in that, because I agree with Willie absolutely that technology for Scotland is critical, given the more remote and rural areas of Scotland, if we're going to help their economic development chances.
This is why I've agreed with Willie in the sense that we should bring it back to the next committee.
But the question is there a timescale though, Convener?
Yes, there is indeed. What's going to happen next is that the Parliament only can say yes or no to the budget, so they don't want to have that vote until they can say yes, for obvious reasons. What will happen in the intervening period is that what's called a trialogue will take place between the Council, the Parliament and the Commission to try and broker a deal which can then be voted on in the Parliament to allow this to move forward. So that will happen, and it will happen in the next 4 months, I'd have thought, because the council.
So we've got time.
Yes, no, absolutely.
I didn't think there was an emergency. That's
no, indeed. Yeah. The one thing to note about the cuts, Willie, which is why this is important, is they've cut the budgets where people didn't expect or didn't have money in the past and therefore weren't used to having it. So I know it sounds like a strange way of putting it, because they didn't have it before, they won't miss it. Is the logic, I think, in some of the cuts. So that's one of the reasons.
Okay. Sorry, James.
Just one point. The conference on the 22nd of February, the half-day conference.
Yes.
None of us have been invited to that, have we?
It's an open invitation.
But it's incredibly short notice, with due respect.
We're not organising it.
Tomorrow.
No, that is my fault, in fact, because it was made available on the website, but it wasn't drawn to the particular attention.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm not blaming you, but we can go if we want.
No, indeed. It was.
I don't know how I'm going to get that.
It wasn't a previous bulletin.
We did put it in earlier, but we. I didn't.
Sorry, I'm not blaming you.
No, that's.
I just wondered whether an invitation had come from via the Europe or anything.
No.
Is there any other questions or points?
Just a quick one. I'm not entirely familiar with the decommissioning added in for Lithuania, Slovakia, Bulgaria. And indeed, that figure seems to match the decommissions figure in the previous thing, which I presume is just coincidence. Is there any further information you can add about
This is one of these areas where it's nuclear decommissioning again. It's because some of the member states in the east need support in order to be able to decommission these slightly older power stations. So they've found money specifically for that. One of the curious things is that the budget has managed to find something for everybody in some way or other. And this is an example of one of the things found for certain member states, which was helping. There has previously been money for decommissioning in this area, because the fear was if it wasn't decommissioned safely and soundly, it would then cause greater environmental and political problems.
Interestingly, Convener, when we met the ambassador with the Convener just 2 weeks ago, the ambassador said that they're actually going to build a new nuclear facility in Bulgaria as well. So
that's a different issue. I mean, that's a different pot for different things. But
absolutely. But I just, just interesting.
Yes, indeed. Any other points, questions? Are the committee happy to send the report to various?
Can I just ask?
Yes.
The fisheries agreement, is that being fairly well received by as far as you know, by our Scottish fishermen?
Jamie, you and I are never going to be satisfied.
Well, no, but Ian is an expert on fishing.
Well, no, I would say that the fishing industry has received it fairly warmly, although fishermen aren't always smiling when they receive these things.
Yes.
But broadly speaking, they seem to be supportive of the principal elements, and they're very appreciative of the suggestion of further localisation of management. That's certainly appealing.
Good. Thank you.
Okay, so if you're happy, if you're content to send this to the relevant committees, we can do that. If we can agree that, yeah. Thank you very much. Then that's the end of the meeting. The next meeting is going to be on the 7th of March, so I look forward for all of you to seeing us then. Thank you very much for your attendance and your assistance.